The Soviet ruble was not, in any real sense, money, not the way you're used to thinking about money. Its value was set by decree, not by any market. You couldn't take it out of the country. You couldn't exchange it, legally, for dollars. It was, functionally, a currency with a hammer and sickle printed on paper nobody outside its own borders would touch. So an entire parallel economy grew up around something else instead. Not gold, not oil exactly, though oil eventually entered the picture in its own strange way. A specific American cigarette, Marlboro. A single pack could get you a taxi ride across Moscow, a room in a decent hotel, or a doctor who would actually see you that day. One American pack of cigarettes, trusted more than the entire official currency of a nuclear superpower. To understand why Marlboro became money, you first have to understand the Beriozka stores. Beriozka, Little Birch Tree, was a real chain of state-run shops that operated across the Soviet Union starting in the 1960s. Foreigners only in practice, diplomats, journalists, the small number of Soviet citizens who somehow had access to hard currency. Inside, Levi's jeans, French perfume, and Marlboro cigarettes, priced officially at a tiny fraction of a ruble in hard currency terms, roughly 24 kopecks according to surviving Beriozka price lists. On an ordinary Soviet street, that exact same pack was, for all practical purposes, priceless. And that gap between what it cost inside the store and what it was worth the moment it stepped outside is what quietly created a currency. Beriozka wasn't a small, marginal operation either. At its peak, the chain operated dozens of locations across major Soviet cities, stocking everything from caviar to Japanese electronics, all of it priced in a currency the vast majority of the country's own citizens were legally forbidden to even hold. The store existed, quite openly, to extract hard currency from anyone who had it, foreigner or Soviet citizen alike. This is the story of how a single American cigarette brand became more trusted than an actual national currency, and what that trust ended up revealing about the country underneath it. Here's how the actual black market math worked. An ordinary Soviet citizen couldn't simply walk into a Beriozka store, but they could buy a pack of Marlboros from a foreigner directly, for rubles, for a favor, for almost anything a tourist might want that a Soviet citizen could actually provide. Once that pack changed hands, it became a genuine bargaining chip. Handed to a landlord, it might cover a month's unofficial rent. Handed to a mechanic, it might mean your car got fixed that same day instead of sometime next year. Slipped quietly to a hospital administrator, it might mean a bed suddenly became available. The ruble was a promise from a government most people had long since stopped fully trusting. A sealed pack of Marlboros was a promise from a company, and indirectly from an entire country, that nobody in the Soviet Union had ever had reason to doubt. An ordinary Soviet worker in this period earned somewhere in the range of 150 to 200 rubles a month, depending on the profession. A wage the state had decided, unilaterally, was what that person's labor was worth. A pack of Marlboros on the street, by contrast, was worth whatever the market said it was worth, which varied, but was never cheap, and never ever went to zero. And Marlboro specifically carried something no ordinary Soviet cigarette could touch: an entire mythology. The cowboy, the open road, a version of freedom Soviet citizens had never been permitted to see for themselves. Lighting one up wasn't just nicotine. For a few minutes, it was the closest thing to a passport most people would ever hold. Foreign visitors themselves quickly learned how to use this to their advantage, whether or not they smoked a single cigarette. A traveler could pack a few extra cartons specifically to trade, rather than to consume, turning a lightweight, easily transported item into a portable form of leverage across an entire trip, from the moment they landed at the airport to the day they flew back out. Guidebooks aimed at Western travelers to the Soviet Union, by the 1970s and 80s, sometimes noted this practice outright, alongside advice about jeans and chewing gum, a strange, unofficial addition to the standard packing list for anyone crossing behind the Iron Curtain. By the very end of the Soviet era, the exchange value had grown almost absurd. A Washington Post correspondent reporting from Moscow in October 1991 described watching a single pack of Marlboros get traded through a short chain of intermediaries for a full metric ton of oil, a quantity of crude worth around $140 on the world market at the time. And no, this is not something anyone made up for effect. That specific trade was documented in print by a Western journalist actually reporting from inside the collapsing Soviet economy. A small, almost absurd data point that captured, better than any official statistic could, exactly how far the ruble's credibility had fallen by the very end. It wasn't only Marlboro carrying this kind of weight either. Levi's jeans and Adidas tracksuits moved through roughly the same channels, at similarly inflated black market prices, for similarly symbolic reasons. But cigarettes had one enormous practical advantage none of those other goods could match. A pack fit in a coat pocket, required no explanation if you were stopped and searched, and could be split apart, traded a few at a time, in a way that a single pair of jeans obviously couldn't. That divisibility mattered enormously in practice. A doctor's favor might be worth an entire carton. A quick word from a shop clerk might be worth exactly 2 cigarettes, handed over on the spot, no negotiation required. Marlboro wasn't just currency in the abstract. It functioned in the most literal sense as small change for an economy that otherwise had none. Cigarettes acting as informal currency wasn't actually unique to the Soviet Union. It's a pattern that shows up almost anywhere an official currency stops being trusted. In prisoner of war camps during the Second World War, cigarettes became the universal unit of exchange, with everything from bread to coffee to basic safety priced in smokes. In American prisons, even after smoking itself was formally banned, cigarettes didn't disappear from the internal economy. They simply became a black market currency, valuable precisely because the official system had removed the legal supply. What made the Soviet version different in scale was simple. The prison, in this case, was an entire continental country of nearly 300 million people, and Marlboro had become, functionally, the most trusted currency operating inside it. Economists who study informal currencies point to the same underlying explanation every time this pattern appears. Whether it's a POW camp in 1940s Germany or a Moscow apartment block in the 1980s, people will always find some object to serve as money given the chance. If the official version stops functioning the way money is supposed to function, the state doesn't get to decide by decree alone what its own citizens actually trust. And this is where the story takes its darkest turn. Not toward violence, but toward a kind of quiet national humiliation the state could never fully admit to. What actually makes something function as real money comes down to 3 things: durability, portability, and universal demand. A sealed pack of Marlboros checked every one of those boxes. The Soviet ruble, by the later Soviet decades, checked almost none of them. Rubles lost real value every time the state printed more of them to cover a widening budget gap. A sealed pack of Marlboros held its value regardless of what any 5-year plan decided that year. Rubles kept you trapped entirely inside the Soviet system. Marlboros, traded carefully enough, could get you access to something, anything, outside it, one small transaction at a time. For 70 years, the Soviet state insisted, in schools and newspapers, in every official channel available to it, that capitalist money was a corrupting fiction. For most of those same 70 years, ordinary Soviet citizens were quietly demonstrating, transaction by transaction, that a pack of American cigarettes functioned as better money than anything their own government had ever printed. There's a specific irony in exactly which product ended up winning that argument. Of all the Western goods that could have become the country's informal currency, jeans, watches, records, cash itself, it was a product literally manufactured to be burned, inhaled, and permanently used up within minutes of purchase. The most disposable object imaginable turned out to be more durable as a store of value than the entire Soviet financial system built to outlast it. If you're finding this as fascinating as I am, hit subscribe. There's a lot more behind this curtain. And yet, the state didn't simply watch this happen without a fight. What nobody smoking a black market Marlboro on a Moscow street corner necessarily thought about was how seriously the authorities actually took the trade in Western goods generally. Speculation laws that carried real prison sentences applied just as much to a carton of cigarettes as to a pair of jeans or a stack of foreign currency, meaning every single transaction, however small, carried genuine legal risk for both sides. Customs officers were specifically briefed to watch for excessive quantities of Western cigarettes in tourist luggage. Confiscations were common enough that a seasoned trader learned to bring in only what could plausibly be explained as personal use. A handful of cartons, never a suitcase. The risk, in other words, was real and constant. It just never once outweighed the demand. Even Soviet officials themselves weren't immune to the appeal, despite the ideology they were paid to enforce. Customs officers, police, and low-level bureaucrats were reportedly not above accepting a pack or two as a quiet, informal toll for looking the other way, meaning the same product the state technically banned from informal exchange was, in practice, sometimes used to bribe the very people tasked with stopping that exchange. That contradiction never really got resolved. It simply became one more quiet, unspoken rule everyone understood and nobody officially acknowledged, much like the rest of the shadow economy running underneath the entire Soviet system. When the Soviet Union formally dissolved in December 1991, the ruble collapsed right along with it. Hyperinflation followed almost immediately. Life savings that had taken families decades to build became, in practical terms, worthless within a matter of months. But the habits built over those 70 years didn't collapse with it. Trading goods directly for goods, trusting a physical object over any institution's promise, those instincts carried straight through into the chaotic market economy that followed, shaping how an entire generation approached money for years afterward. Soviet citizens had spent a lifetime being taught, indirectly but unmistakably, that official paper was just paper, and that a physical thing you could hold, use, or trade was real in a way a government's promise had stopped being. Western tobacco companies noticed the opportunity almost immediately. Philip Morris and its competitors moved quickly into the newly opened Russian market through the 1990s, building domestic factories, sponsoring events, and turning what had once been a smuggled, semi-illegal treasure into something you could simply buy openly at any kiosk on any street corner. A transformation that, in its own way, said everything about what had actually changed. Marlboro didn't cause the Soviet Union to collapse. No single cigarette brand could carry that kind of weight. But it quietly revealed something the state could never comfortably admit out loud: that in a country built entirely around one official version of value, an enormous number of ordinary people had already, privately, chosen a different one. And in a system that depended, more than almost anything else, on everyone agreeing to believe in the same official story, the Soviet Union spent 7 decades trying to convince its own people that money printed by a capitalist government was a corrupting fiction. Its own citizens spent those same 7 decades quietly proving, one transaction at a time, that a pack of American cigarettes made better, more trustworthy money than anything the state itself had ever printed. The ruble went quiet in the end, almost overnight. The instinct to trust the object in your hand over the promise on the page never really did. If this story surprised you even a little, do one simple thing before you go. Hit subscribe. It takes 2 seconds, it costs nothing, and there's another story from behind the Iron Curtain already on its way. You won't want to miss it.